You may be seated. Acting Vice-Chancellor, Professor Andre Kiet, Deputy Vice-Chancellors here today, Executive Deans of Faculty and Deputy Deans. In particular, I would like to convey my special greetings to the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Pamela Maseko, whose faculty is an academic home to Professor Marius Crous, our celebrant here tonight. Colleagues from the Faculty of Humanities, and in particular, the School of Language, Media and Communication, our professoriate, and all members of the Academy here present, members of senior management, students, alumni, the Alumni Association, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, molweni, goeienaand. I recognize that this is also a very special time for family members to join in the celebration, given the various kinds of support they would have given Professor Crous throughout his journey. Some of them are here with us in person, while those who could not be here in person are joining these proceedings on our various live streaming platforms. To them we say welcome. I would also like to take this opportunity to extend my warmest welcome to them and thank them for the material and moral support they provided you, Prof. Crous, throughout your journey. Marius's view about himself is that he is what people would call an inkomer. This is an Afrikaans expression for someone from outside. In this case, someone from outside of Gqeberha. And in view of his inkomer status, there are special people from outside and further afield who are keenly following these proceedings via all the online live streaming platforms made available, including our YouTube channel, as they could not be here in person. Honored guests and colleagues, as has been intimated already, this is one of those rare joyous occasions that bring family together. And I'm delighted that here tonight, Marius is not alone. His family is here to bear testimony to this occasion at which we shall confer the highest honor the university can ever confer to one of its own. In that regard, I wish to extend my heartiest words of welcome to Marius's brother, as well as his sister-in-law, who are here with us. This would certainly not have been a moment to savor for his, this would have been a moment to savor for his late parents. Marius, I think you can rest assured that in spirit, they are keenly following the proceedings and beaming with pride. These were your first lecturers, as you said in the excerpt sent to us. They were the first people who introduced you to words by giving you books as presents, or your father making up what you call nonsense verses in the car. Apart from family, this occasion is also well supported by close friends and fellow academics, especially those within the languages, and more especially those in the creative writing fraternity. Our special words of welcome are extended, especially to those that follow your work. They have sharpened you into who you are. One of your most exceptional students, also a promising literary critic, Luan Staphorst, is also here. I saw you, Luan. Please receive our warmest welcome. Where are you? Yes, there we are. Welcome. He was also a member of the choir. This university prides itself as a bourgeoning bastion of multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. Marius, it is therefore my understanding that among us here is Dr. Dierwald Kuhn, who continues to give you support and was once your MA student. Dr. Kuhn is now teaching in the Faculty of Education here at Nelson Mandela University. Professor Crous, we are honored that at this point in your career, you have remained a part of Nelson Mandela University family. We are proud of your achievements, and we eagerly look forward to listening to your lecture tonight. We congratulate you on your outstanding achievement. Being promoted to the level of a full professor is the pinnacle of achievement as a scholar and a solid affirmation by your peers of your lifelong work. I now request the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Pamela Maseko, to introduce Professor Crous. Thank you.
Mr. Acting Vice-Chancellor, Professor Andre Kiet, Deputy Vice-Chancellors present, other members of senior management, Executive Deans of faculty, colleagues across the different faculties, distinguished guests, students, family, and friends, and our guest of honor this evening, Professor Marius Crous. Let me also offer a special warm welcome to Professor Crous's esteemed guests, especially his brother and sister-in-law, Gerald and Jody Crous. We deeply appreciate your presence on this special occasion. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Crous on this momentous occasion of his inaugural professorial lecture. This event marks a significant milestone in Professor Crous's esteemed academic journey and celebrates his remarkable contributions to the fields of Afrikaans, Dutch, and English language and literature. Professor Crous is the director of the School of Language, Media and Communication, the Faculty of Humanities. He has been a member of the faculty since 2009 after an illustrious academic career within and outside South Africa, as well as a stint as a civil servant in the first democratic parliament of South Africa. With 2 Bachelor of Honors, 3 Master of Arts and doctoral qualifications attained across 3 universities, and in multiple fields, as indicated earlier on, mainly in languages, Afrikaans, Dutch, and English, language and literature. Prof. Crous has demonstrated during his 15 years at our faculty and university an unwavering commitment to academic excellence, research, and the mentorship of students and the wider literary community. And this is recognized nationally with a C3 NRF rating. A testimony to this excellence is his publications of over 60 publications that constitute academic and creative books, book chapters, and accredited journal articles. His colleague and cousin, Alan Murdoch, provides a family context to this and states that from a very young age, it was evident to Marius's family that he was destined to be an educator and an academic. So it was prophesied right at the beginning. Since then, he has proven himself to be a passionate academic who is committed to the pursuit of academic excellence. And despite a no-nonsense reputation, which we know in the faculty, he always has time to advise and mentor both students and fellow academics. Over the course of his distinguished career, Professor Crous has excelled in both research and teaching, earning accolades such as Faculty Researcher of the Year Award and the Vice-Chancellor's Excellence Award for his poetry works. His creative works, which link the present with the past, depicts tensions between colonizer and indigenous people, dualism of life and death, queer bodies and the complexities in understanding people have won him awards, various awards, including the University of Johannesburg's debut prize for South African writing. And for his first collection of poetry, amongst others. Again, his direct no-nonsense approach and pragmatic approach to both academic and non-academic matters can be startling at first, as I experienced as a dean when I came here 3 years ago, but his nurturing spirit is evident for young colleagues and students whom he has mentored over the years. During his time in the faculty, Professor Crous has supervised over 20 doctoral and master students, some of whom have gone on to become his colleagues in the faculty, and as the Deputy Vice-Chancellor has indicated earlier on, some have moved to other faculties in the university. And Dr. Dewald Kuhn, a former doctoral student and now an academic in the education faculty, has said, states that Professor Crous epitomizes the essence of a true literary scholar. As a teacher and mentor, he continues to leave an indelible mark on many current and former students. His continuous willingness to mentor, accompanied by his wit and often strict guidance, not only promotes critical thinking, but also prepares those he teaches and mentors to strive for excellence. An Ethiopian proverb reads, he who learns teaches. And it can be said that Prof. Crous' dedication and continued contribution to academia resonates with these words. And Luan Staphorst, a former master's student, states that as his scholarly mentor, Professor Crous is not only a mentor whom he has shown him what a scholar ought to do, but who a scholar ought to be. Someone who does not only point to a door and questions its ontology, but who, through engaging with the door, describing its poetics and reflecting on its hermeneutics, undoors the space you think you find yourself in. And he goes on to say that when I say I would not have been where I am today with Professor Crous, without Professor Crous, it is not only a cliche, but an understatement. After all, is the word door not simply another word for window? Is window not a metaphor we live our futures by? And could I have been where I am today if Professor Crous didn't show me how to see today? Very profound, Luan. As a member of the Faculty Management Committee, we call him the Grinch, after the movie character. He's not necessarily as ill-tempered as the character, but this is because Marius Crous is always the one who centers us. He is realistic and pragmatic, and sometimes makes us hear those things we would not like to hear. And so we appreciate you, Marius, in our executive committee and management committee in the faculty. Titled, What Do You Read, My Lord? Words, words, words. Professor Marius Crous' inaugural lecture promises to be an engaging exploration of the intricacies of words in literature, drawing from his academic expertise and creative works, demonstrating again why Professor Marius Crous is a leader in his field. The title itself, he indicates, is taken from Shakespeare's Hamlet, and the two keywords, read and words, form the basis of his lecture. His focus is on word meanings and multiple interpretation of words, and promises to delve into his own creative writing as a poet and a teacher. Now, colleagues, please join me in welcoming Prof. Crous to the podium to deliver his inaugural professorial address. Thank you.
I haven't submitted the document yet, so I can add asides and then I will add them later, I think. So, thank you to all these kind words in the welcome, and thank you for all being present here, and thank you for the top brass being here as well. It's quite daunting how to pitch an inaugural lecture, because I've had all kinds of suggestions. Some would say show us pictures, some would say make it humorous, some would say please we don't want to fall asleep and get bored, etc., etc. So I'm trying to accommodate all of you and still sound intelligent. So, okay. So as the Dean suggested, the title is from Shakespeare's Hamlet, and the two words, namely read and words, will form the basis of my reflection on my life as an academic, and then also because both are essential components of any academic project, and both still play a significant role in my everyday life as a reader, a critic, a teacher, a reviewer, a poet, or a translator. Okay. In my lecture, I will briefly focus on the art of reading, reading and meaning, types of reading, and then on a more personalized note, I will focus on the role of the poet as a reader and make reference to my own poems and selection of other poems within Afrikaans literature. And bearing in mind that some in the audience are not literary scholars, I want to start with the following remark made by Andre Brink in his inaugural lecture at Rhodes in 1980, because it still resonates with me. And he says, for people from the world of commerce, politics, or science, it seems inappropriate to consider a question such as, what is literature? They do so based on the following reason. They regard it as a waste of time to focus on literature. How dare you try to find solace in the reading of literature in a world characterized by hunger, disease, oppression, terrorism, or war? However, academics, be they from science or business or medicine, are all in the business of reading. Not necessarily literature, but the business of reading, especially to teach students to read slowly, attentively, and critically. Bearing in mind the caution by Harold Bloom when he says in his book, How to Read and Why, the sorrow of professional reading is that you never experience that pleasure of reading again that you knew in your youth. The way we read now partly depends upon our distance from the universities, where reading is scarcely taught as a pleasure in any of the deeper sense of the aesthetics of pleasure. And we know that, to be very true, it's the same as if you watch a movie with somebody who's in film studies. They are so annoying because they criticize the movie all the time. You can't watch the movie anymore because they find fault every 5 seconds. The same, I know, I used to annoy my brother in the shops when I pointed out the spelling mistakes on products. So we all have our little idiosyncrasies. Now, such a reading, devoid of any emotion, any pleasurable engagement with the ambiguous language, the puns, the double meanings, reminds me of a poem by Enzensberger with the title For a Senior College Textbook, where he says, don't read odes, my son. Read rosters. They are more exact. Unroll the charts before it's too late. Read rosters, which in our context can include instructions to complete workload models, timesheets, etc. But we also need to keep in mind the warning of Cassara when he says, one day, if we go on this trip of reading rosters, we will pay the price for our senseless impoverishment of language when it is not used as a medium of artistic expression. Now, students through the years, when confronted by artistic expression, always ask the same question. Is there only one reading of a text? Is there a correct interpretation of a poem or a text? Must I see what the author saw when writing it? And also then, may I give my own opinion? And this is then followed by the ghastly remark, I don't like poetry because I don't see the deeper meaning in the poem. Now, to console the students, I usually draw, and this is why I've got this strange figure here, I usually draw this rabbit duck on the board, and I say, some of you will see the rabbit, some of you will see the duck, so don't worry, we will accommodate your interpretation. But then somehow, and I'm sorry, I must confess, my new critic nature kicks in, and then I would add, but remember, you must substantiate everything from the text. Elated by the fact that they can spot either the rabbit or the duck, they usually forget the warning at the end. And that is why I'm also very hesitant to do biographical data with students, because if somebody was in a fire accident at some stage, if there's a fire in a poem, that person is burning right from scratch again. So, an older example is in the case of N.P. van Wyk Louw, who is one of the older Afrikaans poets, who wrote a poem called Barriers, Grense. And then at a school, a learner wrote to him and said, my sister is in love and she reads it as a love poem. But my teacher says it's not a love poem, it's a poem about the writing of poetry. So what do you say? And then Louw's response was, it is either a love poem or it's a poem about poetry. You can pick anyone. And I'd be curious to see if the reader, what the teacher said when she read Louw's letter that said you can interpret it in any way you like. So this is not something profound or innovative, because multiple readings of text, open-ended text, no final interpretation or closure are propagated by the post-structuralists. As Derrida has indicated, reading is always a so-called double gesture. We read a text either traditionally, to look at the structure, the construction, the inferences we can deduce, etc., or we can see something that the author also means something other than what the author wanted. For instance, as he puts it in his reading of Rousseau, what the text says versus what the text wants to say. This I have also found liberating as a teacher and a critic, especially if one has to read older texts and you think, oh Lord, this is such a canonized interpretation. Must I share this with the students again and again and again? Is there nothing new that we can say about the text? And then you come in with a contemporary approach and you say, aren't all these men in the poem sexist patriarchs? Or are there no Oedipal yearnings here? Or you can ask yourself, why have certain people agency and why certain people don't have agency? And in this regard, Spivak writes as follows: literature tells us how not to generalize. We must wait to be surprised. We must have enough distance from the intending subject to be able to look at the signals given by the literary text. That is the substance of reading. The more liberal, the better. A major advantage of focusing on what the text wants to say is that we blow new life into older canonized texts, sometimes to the shock and horror of older critics. In my own research, I've recently studied poems written about animals and reread the poems within the framework of what is termed animal studies, a component of eco-criticism. We distinguish between the human and the non-human animal, and we give agency to all sentient beings. I've often heard that animal studies is called a pseudoscience, and I must agree that sometimes when I read Donna Haraway's books, I tend to agree that no, you're going a bit far here. So what is now happening here? The reader becomes now under the spell of what Ricoeur calls the hermeneutics of suspicion, a phrase used to describe the school of suspicion caused by the three antichrists, Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. And the main characteristics of this approach to reading is to unmask lies and to circumvent the obvious, and to draw out less visible and less flattering truths. As part of his or her reading strategy, the reader may decide to read the text either against or with the grain. To read against the grain implies a counterintuitive reading of a text, which, according to Bewes, implies, and I quote, reading the text in the name of the vanquished, those whose fate is visibly only negatively in the form of the text's absences, gaps, and repressions. In the place of the suspicion reading, he posits for a reading that suspends judgment, that commits itself to a more generous, to a most generous reading possible. In contrast, reading with a grain is an effective way of reading an emotive response through close reading of a text. It is useful to take note of this because the affective turn in literary studies has resulted in a combination, on the one hand, of the text and only the text, focusing on the structure, the inference, etc., and on the other hand, a fascinating visceral and a visual appreciation of the text. And here I have another mea culpa moment. I tell my students, mostly undergraduate students, to stay away from a too emotional response to a text. My main reason being that otherwise all poems are suddenly reduced to nice, beautiful, breathtaking, and there are usually no defects in the poem. And I must confess, I'm not by nature what you could call a paranoid reader who approaches a text anticipating the worst all the time. Okay, now I will not follow the customary pattern of summarizing my research topics here, make yet another prediction about the future of Afrikaans, or discussing the renewal of Afrikaans literature with the inclusion of the voices of the marginalized. My research trajectory is underpinned by an interest in Afrikaans literature and poetry in particular. I revive older texts by reading them through new theoretical lenses. And as I said, yeah, anyway. My latest interest is in the theory of thanatology or death studies, which is tied to Mbembe's necropolitics and the post-human way of viewing death and dying from a different perspective. And I must say I've read fascinating stuff so far. I am too inquisitive to focus exclusively on a narrow topic, particularly because somewhere in my head a little voice says, if you focus on queer readings of a particular poet's work, every time people see you coming, they'd smirk and say, here comes the man who wants out the poets again. And I sometimes hear the little voice expressing that in even more obscene vocabulary. I joined ranks here with the Dutch feminist literary critic and filmmaker Mika Bal, who has published a lot, and her CV is online. It's something scary to read. If you want to be depressed, read the CV. She says, my work reflects my octopus-shaped mind. My mind is not linear, and my civil disobedience as an academic who has never felt at ease in any single discipline. This was not because I cannot discipline myself to do what it takes to be an expert. On the contrary, I've taken somewhat of a perverse pleasure in just doing that. But because, and this is important, the excitement of intellectual creativity and analytic discovery always took place on the edge between disciplines. And that's why I'm always fascinated when I encounter European academics. And they say, I just study the spelling of the word whatever in Old German. And then you think, okay, well, how many articles can you write on Old German spelling of? And then they get massive grants from the state. You think, why? Anyway, that's probably in line with the ivory tower theory of being in a university. I don't know. But anyway, and as Mika Bal is a foremost exponent of transdisciplinary approaches to literature, she's someone to be admired and emulated. Okay, so for the remainder of this lecture, I would like to do a bit of navel staring and talk about the poet as reader, the poet in this case being myself. I don't like talking about my own work, but I must confess, sometimes when I read a review or an article discussing the poetry, then I think to myself, I didn't think of that. Where did they get it, Ma? But it sounds good. I think I'll use that point. I think there's that remark, I think it was Robert Browning who said, when I wrote it, God and I knew, now only God knows. So I think that is what we come to. But anyway, so when talking to poets about their poetry, one must always remember that Plato had the wisdom to say, I don't want them in my city. Because they imitate reality, they're often immoral, and they do not respect authority. Nor does it have any function, really. As thus anticipating audience for poetry makes nothing happen. Okay, so in my first collection of poetry called Brief uit die Kolonies, Letter from the Colonies, I engage with colonial and post-colonial theoretical issues and try to give different perspectives, especially that of the indigenous colonized. But one aspect of the imperial project that I still find fascinating, and I forgot the man's name, is the topic of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized men. And there are examples of where you have administrators who had affairs with young boys and men within the colonies that they colonized, and then of course it was never found out, or it was snubbed and said, no, there's nothing like that, or it was sometimes ended up in court. So that is an ongoing, interesting project. And I wrote a poem called Uitreik, Sniffing Out, which is presented from that perspective of this lascivious official who boasts that no one in the administration is aware of his nocturnal escapades. The overconfident official remarks that in the dark bush there is no distinction between slave and master. All are equal until the next day when he's back in his suit and tie and the roles return to the norm. And I think that's what makes it fascinating, that equality in the dark thing, or katzag, whatever in the dark. Poets read other poets for several reasons. One needs to be aware of one's tradition, styles and interests. You need to gauge yourself against your contemporaries as well. and see especially where they're better than you or where you lack, and then you must do something about it. But part of that is also that one must accept one's fate very early, and the truism, do what you love, the money will follow, does not really apply to the writing of poetry. I think, what's that woman's name? Kaur, Rupi Kaur, she's the only one that makes money out of poetry. But she's glamorous, she's sexy, she's beautiful, she's outspoken, etc., and she knows what to write about, and that's why she makes money out of poetry. Poets also read other poets to study techniques, to engage with similar concerns and themes, and enter in an intertextual relationship, where citations from other texts are referenced in one's text. Now, the notion of intertextuality, where you take bits from other texts, or you go into a conversation with somebody else's text, or you quote directly, becomes more and more of a headache in our age to explain to students, because then they would say, well, it's not plagiarism, it's intertextuality. So, because we all live constantly under the sword of plagiarism and AI, so it becomes very difficult to explain this concept of intertextuality. So yes, it's legit, but just keep that in mind. It's not only other poets and poems that are read. The poet treats the world as a text. He's an eavesdropper, a voyeur, and a busybody. In coffee shops, you will spot the poet sitting alone in a corner, watching and listening. And I've tried it with my students on campus one year, and it was fascinating. Then they come back, and some of them have got very good memories, and they can repeat the whole conversation verbatim that they eavesdropped on. And then we could use this for, and then I remember there was one case where the students he was listening to the people talking, and then they stopped and they said, are you listening to our conversation? But he got some very interesting material. And I think people should feel fortunate when this happens, since your glib little remark or your feeble remark might end up in the mouth of an emperor or a philosopher. And having watched my dog digging holes in the garden, for instance, I turned him into some super being able to hear the heartbeat of Gaia under the earth. So that is my poetic license. Of course, another indispensable source is the internet. We have and then it begs the question, were poets more original when they did not have access to endless websites and digitized books? When they had to rely on memory, or go to the library and take out books, or go through microfiche, or that kind of thing. That is an open question, because nowadays it's easier with the internet. Or as the Afrikaans poet Marlene van Niekerk writes in her poem Google Earth, at midnight that her desk becomes a type of cockpit from which she floats over the country and follows rivers with the white arrow of her mouse. From within her virtual spaceship, she not only studies the geography of the land, but in the context of the poem, it also evokes memories of her childhood. Her journey becomes a stream of consciousness exercise, ending on the pin of the hospital where her ailing father is lying in his single bed. And recently I read one of the mentors in an online writers' workshop stated it unequivocally that participants may not have access to Google. I find Google useful for various reasons. And for instance, when I was writing about musical instruments played by Buddhist monks in Tibet, and then I think, I wonder what they call that long trumpet or that little drum they play, or that, and then you look for it, and then you can find Gantas, Dribu, Dunshan trumpets, etc. And then instead of a watered down little poem like Over the Valley, the Sound of Drums, I could opt for Over the Valley, the Beat of Gantas and the Sound of Dungeon Trumpets, Early Morning, played by the forgotten women left behind. Not to mention the visual impact of YouTube videos, where one gets visual triggers, like for instance, sky burials. And there you must have a strong stomach to watch that, because it's quite daunting. Hot air balloons over Cappadocia, a boy blowing bubbles on a station platform, or in one of my poems I used the end to one of von Trier's films where the earth is waiting for this gigantic comet or thing or whatever to destroy them. It was quite scary. I wonder, I thought, was I like some prophetic, because the book was launched and then that next week or so it was COVID. And then I thought, yes, you were playing with that thing eating the earth, so here it goes. And my last collection of poems were written before COVID. And for some reason, I became very fascinated by the life of mystics and the people with the stigmata, or writing poems about saints, how their parents would react when this child said, no, I want to become a priest, or I saw Mary in the field or something. Or they had a mystical vision or something. And perhaps, as I said, my subconscious was preparing me for the COVID times ahead, I don't know. To prove that I'm an enigmatic reader, I became interested in reading medieval texts. Luckily, most of them are in English. I could read a little bit of medieval Dutch. The German is very difficult. So, and then in one of my poems, I have St. Peter speaking to Judas Iscariot, the man who, according to Christian beliefs, was responsible for betraying Jesus. And I knew somewhere, I've read, I think, that St. Peter was allegedly crucified upside down. So I had to read about this in Oregon and Tertullian. And then I, probably due to my nature, I decided, okay, let's have an interesting conversation between the two. And then St. Peter says to Judas, I came off better than you. A basilica is named after me. The keys that unlock heaven and earth were handed over to me. And I could progress from a fisherman to the vicar of Christ. I am the cornerstone of the Holy See. And then, based on the reaction about people who said, oh, these are very esoteric poems, they're so enigmatic, we don't like them. And you're always besotted with these old people from those days. What I also find interesting, I read a letter somewhere between George, what's his name, Buckingham, and King James. And I used that. And now all of a sudden we have the movie with the James, and I think, oh yeah, that's the letter I read somewhere. So here we have the movie now. Anyway, so I've decided, okay, let me stick to short poems with no fancy references, no intertextual markers, and sometimes written in a somewhat demotic or even coarse language. And I want to steer clear of intellectual part. It's very difficult. And write something like the following. A man and his camel on the plain dusted with salt. Alongside his camel, singing about the camel's ancient eyelashes and humps. The camel plays along, lifts his feet to the tune, sways his rump, spits as his cud between the man's feet. A camp dance of beast and man till they dump the salt in the ship's split. So, one way in which the reader, poet's reader, can hone his or her craft is through translation. I have tried to translate some of my poems into English, but it made me uneasy because they look so silly in English, especially the shorter ones. And you think, anyway. But I suppose if I want to read a broader audience, I will have to do it. I have read translations that other people did, or some of the poems that were published, and then I can live with that. But as soon as I start doing it, I feel this unease. I don't know. Maybe the poems were not good enough in the first instance. Translating poetry, as the translators would know, is an arduous task because it is affected by the way in which the poet translator again reads the original, whether he realizes what nuanced meanings are conveyed by the poem, not to mention the rhyme words and the structure. That is very difficult. But there is a theory of deconstruction and translation, which is quite fascinating, where you've got more liberating experience of translating the poem. I've tried it once. Or as Nida points out, in translating poetry, there are very special problems. The most important being a sensitivity for form or expression. And we know with Afrikaans the double ni, that is very difficult to translate as well, because sometimes people, it's used as a stop word at the beginning, at the end, sorry, for a rhyme word, and what do you do now with the English? Translation, according to Spivak in one of her recent essays on translation, and this is quite interesting, is not just the stringing together of the most accurate synonyms by the most proximate syntax. So in other words, you must really engage with the poem. And I sometimes find this translation where they, there's a fancy word, but localize it. I've recently read an Afrikaans translation of Waiting for Godot by Beckett. But then they've put some references to the Free State and the Free State landscape. I know, it must become part of Afrikaans and then you localize it. But I don't, maybe I revere Beckett too much. I don't want Beckett to get involved with the Free State. Let him be. Anyway, Antjie Krog, who is a poet and translator of note, describes literary translation in biblical terms when she says, "Blessed are the translators, for they shall inherit the earth." Because for Krog, the translation of text is a global attempt at transgressing boundaries between hermetically sealed linguistic traditions. It is an enriching experience to liberate ourselves and our literary traditions from the so-called hegemonic viewpoints associated with a particular language and text. So, poets make ordinary language strange, and as such, the translation process becomes challenging. My title, as I said, alludes to the question asked to Hamlet, the brooding trickster of Shakespeare's play, and rather flippantly he suggests by his words, remark that he was reading nonsense or something meaningless. If we take into consideration that Hamlet was a trickster, a critic of moral decay, he was the one that smelled the rot in the state of Denmark, and as someone with a wicked sense of humor, how do I bring all these traits into my conversation here? Is it a reference to freedom of speech, or is it a characterization of the academic as an organic intellectual? Words become more than just symbols on the page. It is a process of words reaching out to other words and other meanings to find what is hidden. It is, as Isa, one of the exponents of the reception theory, states, a game whose purpose is to discover the rules, but in a process by which the rules perpetually change and always remain undiscoverable. Maybe that is our key to getting students to read and say, well, the two interpretations. Let's see who's got the better of the two or something. I don't know. But anyway, poets interact with their readers and often address their readers directly. Breitenbach, for instance, addresses the reader directly in his poem Isis 1, and he compares the act of reading to somebody sitting at the table trying to put a puzzle together. There is a symbiotic relationship between the poet and the reader, with the reader's hands, in his case described as scrambling rodents. The reader is almost in some form of meditative state, and there's even a suggestion of an erotic relationship between the author and the reader. But also, the author needs the reader, because in the final part of the poem he exclaims, "In God's name, please don't leave me incomplete, but never complete everything, because I want to remain a part of you." Authors need readers, readers need authors and books, even if it's commonly believed that one should never meet an author because you will be very disappointed. Okay, so let me end with Roland Barthes. He wrote a wonderful book called The Pleasure of the Text in 1973, and he prompted the very astute but rather conservative Harold Bloom to say, "I'm not a purveyor of this idea of the erotics of reading." Barthes distinguished between texts of pleasure and texts of bliss. He uses the word jouissance, which can almost be described or translated as orgasmic pleasure. So reading is like orgasms. Do we read pleasure and focus on structure and technique and meaning? Or do we read a text with perverse pleasure, allowing ourselves to experience the text in a bodily manner? Dearest reader, I leave you with that. Thank you.
Professor Crous, it is my privilege to, on behalf of Council, Senate, our Vice-Chancellor, and the entire university community and beyond, congratulate you on a compelling and entertaining inaugural lecture. Marius is a well-rounded literary scholar with 4 collections of Afrikaans poetry and a wide-ranging suite of scholarly work to his name. And he treated us with an inaugural composition that is provocatively titled. Aware of the significant value words have in academic work as indispensable resources for literary scholars and scientists in other disciplines, Marius' insightful commentary on the topic of reading and multiple interpretation in the context of literary analysis is also truly compelling. In addition, he showcased his passion for creative writing, both as a lecturer, a reader, and a poet, highlighting how it influenced his creative writing journey. He importantly reads, amongst other appellations, the poet as reader, and the wordplay here is intended. Prof. Crous, your work with your partners, colleagues, and students is of great social and epistemic value, contributing in great measure to the idea of an examined life without which our engagement with ourselves and the world would be significantly poorer. Selwyn Mulborough beskryf Prof Crous se 2020 werk Tussenganger as vol draadwerk en bekeer 'n moeilike bundel. Nou ek sê net jy is vol draad nie, maar Marius. Selwyn plays between the titles of two of Marius's poetry collections, and these collections reads the difficulties associated with the multifaceted and complex meanings of vol draadwerk in ways from which something productive can emerge through an authentic and necessary laborious engagement with life, loss, death. Congratulations, Marius, and best wishes on your career further and the task lying ahead. Please give Marius a warm round of applause. Great listening to this lecture. May I also express the gratitude of our university for your contributions, Marius, over many years, and especially relay the thanks of our Vice-Chancellor, the Executive, and our Governing Council. I would now like to take the opportunity to share a message with you from the President of our Alumni Association. Dear Prof Crous, congratulations on your inaugural lecture. The Alumni Association looks forward to your support and involvement in our activities. To mark this very special occasion in your academic career and your time at Nelson Mandela University, on behalf of the association, I would like to present you with this symbolic gift. Best wishes for all your future endeavors. In closing, I would like to convey our thanks to those who are attending this inaugural lecture in person and virtually. Your interest in the work of Marius and that of our university is much appreciated. Thanks to our DVC Learning and Teaching for the welcoming remarks. This is also the acting DVC Engagement and Transformation. And our Executive Dean of Humanities, Pam, for introducing Prof Crous to us. Thanks also to Marius' special guests, friends, family, and colleagues. His late parents would have been proud. His brother and sister-in-law are here, many thanks. The Dean and colleagues in the Faculty of Humanities, Marius also wanted me to relay a special thanks to you. His students in general, and by name the exceptional Luan Staphorst, and the very supportive Dewald Kuhn. Now, of course, I'm just taking this directly from Marius' notes, on how I should construct these. Hanina Loubser, one of his key teachers, Louise Viljoen, his promoter and colleague, Elise van Vieren, his predecessor, and the late Dani Jordan. And Marius, thanks for bringing these all together in your direction for these particular thank you and closing remarks. Least but by no means last, thank you to the institutional governance team in the office of our registrar, our communications and marketing team, and our ICT team that made the inaugural lecture possible. You've done a great job. Friends, this brings to a close the inaugural lecture of Professor Crous. You are invited for light refreshments in the foyer. I request the audience to stand whilst the academic procession leaves the venue. Thank you.